What if the meal you scraped together tonight, with its meager portions and whispered apologies, was the last one your children remembered without hunger's sharp edge? In the dim glow of a single kitchen bulb, Minh and Aiko Nguyen stood frozen, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of a world that had shifted without warning. The rain outside hammered the tin roof of their row house, echoing the turmoil in his chest. Aiko, his wife of 8 years, sat at the scarred wooden table, her hands trembling as she portioned out the last of the rice, 3 small bowls for their children, and 2 even smaller for themselves. Lynn, their 6-year-old daughter, watched with wide eyes, her spoon hovering uncertainly. Beside her, 4-year-old Kai fidgeted, his small fingers drumming on the table's edge, while Bobby Sora fussed in her high chair, her cries piercing reminder of milk that might not come tomorrow. Min's layoff had come first, a curt email from the auto plant. Position eliminated due to restructuring. He had stared at the screen, his calloused fingers clenching into fists. Welding was in his blood, a skill passed from his father, in the glow of backyard forges back in Vietnam, where sparks flew like defiant stars. Yet here, without certification, his talent was just another shadow in the unemployment line. Weeks later, Aiko's turn came. A video call, her supervisor's face pixelated on the screen. Advancements in AI will handle the data entry now. Efficiency for the company. The word lingered in Aiko's mind, like a bitter aftertaste. Algorithms, faceless, tireless, had claimed her place, leaving her to stare at job listings that demanded skills she did not have. A food stamps card in her wallet, once a temporary bridge, now felt like a chain. The children sensed it, the subtle tightening of belts, the way dinner conversations skirted worry like leaves before a gale. Lynn had begun drawing pictures at school, families at tables overflowing with food, stick figures with smiles that reached their eyes. "For us, Mommy," she said one evening, pressing a crayon masterpiece into Aiko's hands. Kai would climb into Min's lap after bedtime stories, his tiny hands tracing the scars on his father's palms. "Daddy fix it?" he would ask, and Min would force a chuckle, the sound hollow. Sora, too young for words, responded in wails that echoed through the night, her hunger a raw plea that clawed at their hearts. In those shadowed hours, as the rain drummed its relentless tattoo, Min would pace the living room, his mind a whirlwind of what-ifs. What if another jag came through, some under-the-table weld that paid enough for formula and rent, but the what-ifs twisted into darker shapes? What if the lights went out? What if the children's faces grew gaunt, their laughter fading like embers in ash? Aiko would reach for his hand, her touch a lifeline in the gathering dark. "We endure," she would whisper, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath, echoing the resilience her mother had taught her through tales of post-war Tokyo. Yet endurance felt like a thin thread, fraying under the weight of unpaid bills and the government shutdown, whispers of delayed food stamps benefits slithering through the news like smoke. Sunday morning arrived like a hesitant truce, the rain relenting to a misty veil. Min bundled the children into coats too thin for the chill, Aiko smoothing Sora's hair with trembling fingers. Mary's loomed at the end of Oak Street, its brick facade weathered but steadfast, stained glass windows catching the weak light. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished pews and fresh coffee, organ notes swelling like a collective breath held too long. They slipped into a back row as Father Reyes's voice rolled through the sanctuary. Words of provision in scarcity, manna in the desert, seeds sown in barren soil. Mel bowed his head, his welder's hands clasped in supplication, the calluses rough as prayer beads. Beside him, Aiko murmured in Japanese, her eyes fixed on the crucifix, where light danced like fleeting hope. The children fidgeted quietly, Lin tracing crosses in hymnal dust, Kai whispering questions about the pretty colors in the windows. Sora dozed against Aiko's shoulder, her tiny fist curled like a promise, yet to unfold. From the shadows of the vestibule, Elias watched, his arms crossed over a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows. The pastor's sermon washed over him, what you do for the least of these. But it was the Nijin's hushed exchange with Father Reyes after the service had snagged his ear. Formula for the baby, Aiko said, her voice barely holding together, and rice, just enough to stretch the food stamps. Min nodded, his jaw set, pride warring with need. Elias shifted, the creak of his boots lost in the postmass murmur. Kids, the word lodged in his throat. Lena's face flickered in his mind, her laugh in the garden, Chimo's shadow stealing her light, their dream of little feet pattering through empty rooms, left as ash. 15 years since her last breath, and still the silence echoed through his house, through the machine shop that bore her name. What if it were his? What if the shutdown's cruel math left them scavenging like strays? His fists clenched. Not on my watch, not while breath remained. As the family gathered coats in the narthex, Elias lingered, his gaze sharpening on Min's hands, those capable palms that could shape metal if given the flame. The potluck tables beckoned with steam rising from casseroles, a fleeting feast amid the want. Aiko lifted Sora, the baby's weight a whirled on her shoulders, while Lin hugged Min's sleeve, her eyes bright with unspoken pleas. Elias stepped forward, his voice a gravel rumble cutting through the chatter. Welder, you said? The word hung like a spark in dry air as the family turned, their faces a canvas of wary hope. The rain had stopped outside, but inside, a different storm brewed, wine of possibility, fragile as the first light through parting clouds. The dim hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in Elias's machine shop, where shadows stretched long across the concrete floor, pooling around workbenches scarred by decades' sparks and sweat. Tools hung in meticulous rows, hammers with handles worn smooth, clamps gripped like unyielding faith, each one a silent witness to the life Elias had hammered out alone. He stood at the far end, his broad frame silhouetted against the open bay door, where the afternoon rain drizzled in lazy sheets. In his gnarled hands he held a faded photograph, the edges curled like petals pressed too long in a book. Lena's smile gazed back at him, her eyes alight with the kind of joy that had once filled their small home with music and half-finished gardens. They had dreamed of children then, tiny hands tugging at her apron, laughter echoing through rooms meant for more than echoes. But cancer had come like a thief in the night, stealing not just her breath, but the future they had sketched in quiet whispers. He remembered the promise he would made at her bedside, his voice rough against the hum of monitors. I will build something lasting, Ina, something that holds. The words had been for her a vow etched in grief, but they hung unfinished. No kids, no grandkids to inherit the shop or the stories. Just this cavernous space filled with the ghosts of projects completed for strangers. He tucked the photo back into his wallet and turned to face the week ahead. The following Sunday arrived, with a sky the color of bruised steel, clouds hanging low over the town like a shroud pulled tight. Elias arrived at Mary's early, his truck rumbling into the lot with the growl of an old beast roused from slumber. He lingered in the vestibule as congregants filed in, and when the Jennings entered, Min carrying Sora on his hip, Aiko herding Lin and Kai, with gentle nudges, he watched from the shadows, his arms crossed like a barrier against the softening in his chest. Father Reyes's homily wove through the nave. In the wilderness of want, it is the hand extended, not in judgment, but in quiet strength that parts the waters. Elias shifted, the words pricking like sparks on bare skin. As the service ended, the family lingered, approaching the pastor in the aisle. "The food stamps are holding, Father," Min said, his tone clipped with the pride of a man clinging to dignity, "but the baby's teething, and winter's coming." Aiko nodded, her eyes downcast, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Just guidance, perhaps, a job lead, anything to bridge the gap. Elias moved then, his boots heavy on the tile, emerging from the side, like a storm cloud, given form. Father Reyes spotted him first, surprise flickering across his face, before smoothing into warmth. "Elias, good to see you here. Folks, this is Elias Grant, runs the forge down on Mill Street." Min turned, his stance straightening instinctively. Aiko's gaze lifted, cautious but kind. Sora stirring in her arms with a soft whimper. Elias met their eyes, his own narrowed beneath bushy brows. "Heard you last week," he grunted, the words tumbling out gruffer than intended. "Welder, you said, been piecing gigs, no papers to back it." Min stiffened, pride flaring. "Yes, sir. Learned from my father, good enough for most jobs, but the big ones want the stamp." Aiko interjected softly, her voice steady as a mother's anchor. "We managing, truly. Just stability for the little ones." Elias rubbed his beard, buying time as internal tempests raged. "Teach them to fish," his mind echoed, Lena's proverb rising unbidden. Not handouts, but tools at built legacies. But these were not faceless hires. They were flesh and breath, with eyes that mirrored the voids in his own life. "Shop's got a spot," he said at last, the words scraping out like metal on stone. "Fair wage, steady hours, but no charity. You work the line, learn the code. I will cover night classes for that certification. Condition 1. He paused, eyes flicking to the children. "Condition 2. Soon as you are certified and get a promotion, you start paying me back. No interest, no shame, just square." Min's skepticism coiled kite. "Trust a stranger's forge. Hand over the hammer to a man whose scowl could curdle milk." Yet Aiko's hope flickered, a spark in the gloom. For the children, they would brave any fire. "Why us?" Min asked, voice low, probing the offer's edges. Elias's gaze softened a fraction, mist gathering unbidden at the corners. "Because I know empty chairs," he rumbled, "lost mine to cancer's cold hand." will not watch yours go hungry to pride or politics. Silence stretched, the rain tapping the windows like impatient fingers. Finally, Min extended his hand, rough palm meeting Elias's weathered grip. We accept, and we will pay every cent back. Elias nodded once, decisive as a struck weld. Good. Monday morning, 6 sharp. Do not be late. The first days blurred into a rhythm of fire and fatigue, the shop's roar swallowing Min whole. Sparks flew like defiant stars from the arc welder, illuminating the concrete in brief, blinding bursts. Elias loomed at the edge of the bay, arms crossed, his voice a gravel thunder over the hiss. Straighten at B, doy. Sloppy work feeds no mouths, builds no homes. Min nodded, sweat beading on his brow, the mask's heat pressing like the weight of expectation. His hands moved with a precision born of necessity, fusing metal plates that would one day hold up bridges or frame houses for families not his own. Yet doubt lingered in the seams, a stringer's forge indeed, where every strike tested not just steel, but the man wielding the torch. Home became a sanctuary of small victories, Aiko transforming the food stamps allotments into meals that stretched, rice simmered with herbs from the church garden, vegetables bartered from neighbors in quiet exchanges. The children, sensing the shift, filled the evenings with their unfiltered light, line sketching Daddy's fire pictures on scrap paper, crayons capturing the orange bloom of welds, Kai clambering onto Min's lap after baths, demanding tales of the big shop monster who growled but never bit, Sora, teething less fretfully now, cooing at the rattle Aiko fashioned from spare bolts. In those moments, as the rain pattered against the window, Aiko would meet Min's eyes across the table. One step, she would whisper, and the path widens. Weeks ground on, the certification looming like a final test. Nights at the community college, fluorescent hum, mingling with the scratch of pencils on blueprints, Min's eyes burning from dual flames of day and study. Aiko quizzed him over tea steeped strong as resolve. This seam here, she would say, finger tracing lines in the lamplight. It holds the weight? And he would nod, the analogy blooming unspoken. Their family, too, a structure under strain, needing the right bonds to endure. Elias footed the bills with a checkbook stubbed like old leather, his mutters at the counter masking the quiet satisfaction of investment, not in pity, but potential. Yet doubt surged in the quiet hours when the house settled into sighs and the children's breaths evened into sleep. Min would stare at the ceiling, cracks spiderwebbing like the fears in his chest. Am I the chain dragging them deeper, or the ladder they climb? The shutdown's shadow lengthened, news snippets filtering through, families lining up at pantries, food stamps glitches turning meals to dust. Aiko would find him there, her hand on his shoulder, a cool compress to the fever of uncertainty. We bend, but we do not break, she would murmur, yet endurance felt like a thin thread. The certification exam loomed, its date circled in red on the calendar, a gauntlet where one flawed seam could unravel it all. The crisis crested on a Thursday, the shop alive with the acrid tang of molten metal and the whine of grinders. Elias had set Min on a rush job, a structural beam for a local bridge repair, deadlines pressing like storm fronts. No room for mercy here, Elias growled, eyes sharp as calipers, measuring a man's worth. Min nodded, mask down, the torch's blue flame dancing in his grip. The bead ran smooth at first, a silver river binding the plates, but fatigue clawed at his focus, the ache in his shoulders from dual shifts, the whisper of Sora's cough in his mind. A slip, infinitesimal, the angle veering just a hair too wide, the arc spat back, searing through glove and flesh in a bloom of agony. Me staggered back, the torch clattering to the bench, his hand a throbbing star of red and black. The shop fell silent, the other hands freezing mid-motion. Pain lanced through him, sharp as judgment, but deeper still was the shame, the flaw exposed, the progress cracked. Damn it, he hissed, through gritted teeth, visions flashing, the exam in 2 days, the promotion hanging by this thread, the children's faces if he faltered now. Lilius was there in an instant, barking orders, get the kit now, before guiding Min to the side bench with a grip firm, but not unkind. As he peeled back the singed glove, exposing the raw welt, his face softened, the ornery mask slipping. Seen worse, he muttered, dousing the burn with cool saline, the sping drawing a hiss from Min's lips. Silence stretched, broken only by the distant patter of rain, a rhythmic pause adviated confession. Elias's hands worked the antiseptic in with care, his voice emerging low, gravel worn smooth by time. Lena burned out slow, cancer's fire eating from the inside. No quick flash, just a steady hollowing. Me, I fought with every damn tool in this place, but some flames you cannot weld shut. His eyes grew distant, fixed on something far beyond the shop's walls. Minnie swallowed against the pain. This, it is nothing, but the exam. Tomorrow now, with this hand, what if I cannot hold the line? Elias met his gaze, the blue eyes sharp yet kindled something fiercer than command. You fight it with sweat, son, not perfection, but persistence. Lena said that the seam holds not because it is flawless, but because it is forged with intent. You have got the intent. The rest follows the strike. He bandaged the hand with deliberate raps, each loop a quiet vow, the shop's hum resuming around them like a heartbeat steadying. As Min flexed his fingers, tentative sparks of resolve igniting, the rain outside eased to a drizzle, a herald, perhaps, of clearer skies. The exam unfolded under the college's sterile lights, like a trial by blueprint and flame. Me arrived with his bandaged hand, a badge of endurance, the room filled with aspirants, hunched over tests that mapped futures in ink and diagram. Questions loomed, stress loads, alloy tolerances, safety protocols, etched in code, but he traced them with the precision of a torch's edge. Aiko's midnight quizzes a ghost at his shoulder, Elias's gruff mantra a drumbeat in his veins. The practical loomed largest, a mock weld under scrutiny, the arc flaring glue against his mask, pain a distant throb as he laid the bead straight and true. When the proctor called time, Min removed his gear, sweat carving rivers down his face. The verdict a breath held too long. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Minnie stared at it on the kitchen table, his hands trembling worse than they had under the torch. Aiko stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, The children clustered around with wide eyes. He tore it open, the paper crinkling loud in the sudden silence. Pass. The word read, simple and unadorned. The certification was his. Aiko's arms wrapped around him, her laugh breaking like sunlight through clouds. Lin and Kai erupted in cheers they did not fully understand, dancing around the table while Sora clapped her tiny hands in mimicry. Moni buried his face in Aiko's shoulder, his body shaking with something between laughter and tears. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." The promotion landed swift as a struck spark, a call from the mill foreman. 2 days later, voice crackling over the line. "Heard you're certified now. We need hands like yours. Steady pay, benefits, that works. Can you start Monday?" Min's voice broke on the thank you, the phone trembling in his grip. When he hung up, he stood in the kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing, before turning to face his family. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders 4 months lifted just a fraction, but enough to breathe. That evening, he calculated the numbers at the kitchen table, pencil scratching across paper in the lamplight. The new wage, minus expenses, left enough to begin repayment. It would take time, months, maybe a year, but the path was clear now, visible where before there had been only fog. Aiko sat across from him, Sora nursing quietly in her arms, and watched him work. "How much?" she asked softly. Min looked up, meeting her eyes. 50 a week to start. More when we are steadier." She nodded, her smile small but genuine. "Elias will understand." The next morning, Min arrived at the shop before dawn, the first check tucked in his shirt pocket. The crew was already filtering in, thermoses steaming in the cold air, boots spuffing against concrete. Elias stood at his usual post by the bay door, arms crossed, watching the sky lighten from black to gray. Min approached, the check graying warm against his chest. "Got something for you," Min said, pulling out the envelope. Elias turned, eyebrows raised, and took it without a word. He opened it there in the cold morning air, the check fluttering slightly in the breeze. For a long moment he stared at it, his weathered face unreadable. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet, the same worn leather relic that held Lena's photograph. "Squared a bit," Min said, the words heavy with gratitude unspoken. Elias pocketed the wallet without flourish, his nod a seal on the joint. "Debt's not the chain, boy. It is the temper. Makes the steel sing." He clapped Min on the shoulder once, hard enough to sting, then turned back to the shop. "Now, get to work. That beam will not weld itself." The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, steadier than before, but no less full. The mill job brought not just wages, but dignity, a badge Min wore on his coveralls, proof that his hands built things that mattered. Aiko's own path widened when a temp agency call led to steady hours at a local nonprofit, her organizational grace turning chaos into order for families, much like theirs had been. The food stamps card stayed in her wallet, but now as a memory, rather than a lifeline, a reminder of how close they would come to the edge. Home transformed in subtle ways. The fridge filled with more than necessity, fresh greens from the market, milk for Sora's bottle, fruits that stained Kai's fingers with sticky joy. Laughter echoed once more, Lin's drawings evolving from sparse tables to feasts under rainbows. her crayons capturing the magic shop your daddy made fire pictures that paid for dreams. Evenings bloomed with ritual, baths drawn steaming, stories read in tandem voices, minds eat timber, weaving Vietnamese folk tales of clever foxes and resilient rivers, Aiko's lilting cadence, adding Japanese whispers of cherry blossoms, enduring winter's bite. Sora's babbles turned to first words, her tiny hands reaching for the world with a trust that mended the frayed edges of their fears. Elias wove into this tapestry, his presence a thread of gruff gold. Sunday dinners at the Nigans became ritual, the table laden with pho, simmered slow, and sushi rolls wrapped with care, chopsticks clinking like chimes in the lamplight. "Pass the pho, or I will weld it shut," he would quip, his ornery barks drawing shy smiles from Lin, who perched on his knee demanding tales of the big fire monster. Kai would mimic the shop's sparks with finger wiggles, eliciting Elias's rare chuckle, a sound like gravel giving way to spring soil. Aiko watched with quiet gratitude, her hand finding Min's under the table. The cultural chasms that once loomed now bridged up shared bowls and stories swapped like heirlooms. One evening, as the children played in the next room and steam rose from their bowls, Elias called Min aside, voice low over the clatter. "Heard you took on apprentice at the mill. Kid fresh out of high school." Min nodded. "Figured I would pass it on. Same way you did for me." Elias was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Lena used to say, "It is the ripple that fills a river." Guess she was right. The bond between them, once forged in desperation, had tempered into something unbreakable, not blood, but something deeper, sweat and fire and shared purpose. The government shutdown eventually ended, food stamps, benefits flowing again to those still waiting. But in the Nguyen household, the crisis had passed, leaving behind not just survival, but transformation. Mi continued his weekly payments to Elias, each check a promise kept, until one morning the old man waved him off. "We are square," Elias said gruffly. "Been square for a while. Just wanted to see if you would finish what you started." Min tried to argue, but Elias cut him off with a look. "Use it for the kids' college fund, something." Lena would have wanted that. On a crisp autumn morning, Elias stood at Lena's grave, dew beating on a headstone like unshed tears. In his pocket he carried a photograph, not the old one of Lena alone, but a new one. The Nguyen family clustered around him at Sunday dinner, children laughing, Min and Aiko beaming, his own weathered face caught mid-smile. He pulled it out, studying it in the early light. "You would like them," he whispered to the wind. Lena's laugh a rustle in the leaves overhead. "Our legacy lives, not in empty rooms, but in the hands we steady, the tables we fill." He tucked the photo back into his wallet, next to Lena's portrait, 2 images now, instead of one. The ache in his chest had not vanished. It never would. But it had shifted, transformed into something he could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. He turned from the grave, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, and walked back to his truck. The shop waited, and with it, another day's work. But now the empty chairs did not echo quite so loud. Now there were Sunday dinners to look forward to, children's laughter to fill the spaces Lena had left behind. He would build something lasting after all, not the legacy he would imagined. but one forged in fire nonetheless. In a world of empty tables and shuttered doors, what if one hand extended, not in pity, but in the forge of shared sweat, changed the feast for generations? What day miracle hid, not in the stars, but in the scars we choose to mend? The answer lived now in a modest row house, where children laughed, in a shop where sparks flew like defiant stars, in the space between promise made and a debt repaid. If this tale stirred your heart, share your forge moment below. What hand extended your ladder in the heat of want? Hit subscribe. Grace forges in the grind, turning trials to triumphs, one strike at a time.